Dear learners, I'm Christina Georgy, your academic counselor, and I welcome you to my session on BSOG 173, which is titled Rethinking Development. So as requested by the learners, this session will also be recorded. And the topic we are addressing today is unit titled Feminist Perspectives. So if you remember, in our last session, we dealt with Unit 8 of Rethinking Development. Unit 8 is titled Environmental Perspectives. So today we will move on to the feminist perspectives with respect to development. Before moving on to your study material as such, let me ask you a question. What do you understand by the term feminist? Or who is a feminist according to you? I'll give you time to respond using the chat box, because it is of great importance to have an idea regarding what this particular term means before moving on to this feminist perspective with respect to development. Okay, Lakshmi has given the answer. A person who advocates for equality and equal opportunities for all the genders. Perfectly correct. That is a very correct response. Someone who fights for the rights of women and equality of women. Yes, true. Yes, correct. So for those who are still not very clear regarding this term, let me explain this to you. That is, a feminist is somebody who supports equal rights for women or for all genders for that matter. Yes. So in this scenario, it is equally important for you to have an idea regarding this concept of feminism. So what do you mean by feminism? How do you understand feminism? In simple terms, it's about respecting the diverse women experiences, identities, knowledge and strength, and also striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. So it is advocating equal opportunities and rights for women as well. So this is the basic premise of feminism. I hope I made it clear to you. Is that clear? Thank you. So, I would like to have your attention towards some major key terms that we use with respect to feminism or gender studies for that matter. So, have you heard of this term patriarchy? Patriarchy. Yes, I'm glad that you have heard. So, could you please tell me what the meaning of this particular term is? We often use the term patriarchal society to describe the socio-political conditions these days. So, do you know the actual meaning of this particular term patriarchy? Yes, it's simply male domination. Very correct. Yes, correct. All your answers are correct. So, a social system that gives power and control to men rather than women can be considered as a patriarchal system. It refers to male domination both in public and private spheres. So, these feminists mainly use this term patriarchy to describe the power relationship between men and women. So, an example of patriarchy in society would be where the men hold the control and make rules while the women stay at home and look after their kids. So there is another prominent term with respect to these gender studies and feminist studies, that is stereotyping. Do you have any idea what stereotype means? Stereotype. Yes, if so, can you please try to answer using the chat box? Yes, that is an example. Blue for boys, an example for stereotyping. Yes. So what exactly is stereotyping? Yes, that's also correct. Pink for girls, a stereotype indeed. So what exactly is stereotyping? I'll help you out. Stereotype refers to a fixed idea about a particular type of person or thing which is often not true in reality. For example, like we saw in the chat box, there is this notion that boys would love blue color whereas girls would prefer pink color. Similarly, it is considered as if girls should play with Barbies while boys should play using cars or trucks for that matter. Similarly, the notion of woman as the reproducer, or the notion that a woman must set up a family as her chief priority, all such things are actually cultural stereotypes. Do you have any other example for cultural stereotyping? So I would like to remind you that often students get confused between these two terms, sex and gender. I want you to know that sex is a biological construct, whereas gender is a social construct. Okay, gender connotes the cultural meaning attached to sexual identity. In other words, gender is the product of culture conditioning. Often as a result of this culture conditioning, men dominates the society and women often get oppressed or suppressed in the society. So this would serve as a background for your effective understanding of Unit 9 of Feminist Perspectives, that is Unit 9 of BSOG 173. If in case you're interested to know more about feminism and feminist perspectives, you may please check out a video of mine based on feminist criticism and feminist theories. I'll share the link with you. Yes. So that was the general introduction. So shall we move on to your textbook as such? Thank you, Rinsa. Yes. So if you look at page number 117 of your study material, under section 9.1, you can see how the World Development Report of 2012 defines gender equality as a core objective of development. So it states that, I quote, justice development means less income poverty or better access to justice. It should also mean fewer gaps in well-being between males and females. I unquote. We all know that women are integral to sustainable development. We discussed sustainable development in our last class. If you haven't attended the session, make sure that you refer to the video and study, because that would definitely be a 20-mark essay question for your upcoming TEE. That is one section that is very easy to study. Hence, never leave that section and there will be a sure 20-mark question on that topic. While discussing that particular unit, we also dealt with the important questions for TEE. Make sure that you have an understanding on that. Coming back to our topic, globally, the progress of women in the fields of education, health, rights and employment has had considerable improvement. True. But do you believe that the rate of this progress is appreciable, or has that actually evolved in a considerable extent? No, we can say that the changes have not affected all the women alike. Especially women in the underdeveloped countries still remain on the lower end of the development spectrum as compared to the women in the first world countries. So, Before moving on to the historical developments, let me once again take your attention towards feminist movements. I suppose you have an idea regarding feminist movements. If not, let me give you a brief idea. Feminist movement refers to a series of social movements. That is, these movements are social and political campaigns for radical and liberal reforms on women's issues. What is the cause of these issues? The primary cause is the inequality between the sexes. Alright, so traditionally, feminism is often divided into some schools. Do you have any idea regarding the main types of feminism? How many are they? The primary types of feminism? Are you aware of this? Alright, I'll explain. This is something that you just have to have an idea. Traditionally, feminism is often divided into three major schools. These are known as the big three schools of feminist thoughts. That is liberal or mainstream feminism, radical feminism, and social or Marxist feminism. Firstly, liberal or mainstream feminism. Secondly, radical feminism. Thirdly, social or Marxist feminism. In your course book, they haven't elaborated on all these aspects. So I thought it would be of great help to you if I explain this background details in class. Now, it's time for us to trace the history of these movements. So, during the 1950s and 60s, the issues related to women were addressed. But these issues were addressed only as part of general human rights. That is, not much attention could be paid to their comprehensive development, let's say. At the same time, the contribution of the women in the economic progress was also not at all acknowledged. They still lacked political and social powers. So if we look at 1970s, things began to change slightly on an international perspective, and it was recognized that policies of development had an adverse effect on women. So this recognition came during the second wave of feminism. There are primarily 4 waves of feminism. You don't have to have a detailed knowledge on this with respect to your BSOG syllabus, but if interested, you can check out my video and understand the different waves of feminism. Various feminists addressed the issue of development through an integrative approach through the lens of economics, ecology, productive model, patriarchy, and colonialism. Now, if we look at section 9.2 titled The Rise of the Width and the Word Approaches, there we'll discuss the genesis of 2 important approaches with respect to gender and development. Dear learners, this is something that you need to study. This is important. Remember the width and word approaches, which are namely Women in Development approach and Women and Development approach. So WID is simply Women in Development approach, whereas WAD or WED is Women and Development approach. Have you ever heard of these approaches before, or is it the first time? You haven't heard, I suppose. Okay, then I'll explain. So there was a Danish feminist. Her name is Esther. So in one of her books titled Women's Role in Economic Development, which was written in the year 1970, this particular feminist mentioned the intersection of gender and development. How gender and development are interlinked. Such an aspect was first addressed by Esther in the year 1970. So, based on her research in Africa, she criticized post-1945 Western development model as being exclusionary towards women. That is, women got no privileges with respect to that model. So, in this development model observed by her, women were included only as a passive beneficiaries. What do you mean by passive beneficiaries? For example, they were considered only as housewives or mothers or even childbearing machines for that matter. So this model favored men as the breadwinners of a family and totally discounted women's contribution in various aspects of life, may that be in the field of agriculture, food production, etc. That is, men had an upper hand or consideration, whereas women were totally discarded. Are you able to follow me? Are you able to follow my explanation? So the United Nations organized a conference on women in the year 1975. This conference was held at Mexico. They declared the next decade as the decade of women. That is, in 1975, they declared the next decade as the decade of women. Do you know why this was done? This was aimed at the reversing of the exclusion of women in the development discourse, and they wanted to make their productive and reproductive works a part of the national economies. So we can say that this is what led to the genesis of WID approach. That is, this led to the formation of Women in Development approach. So what was actually this WID approach? It was an approach developed by various players in the development arena. For example, this included the NGOs, the policy makers, etc. So why was this actually formed? It was formed to evaluate the status of women from passive beneficiaries to program beneficiaries. Just from being the child rearing machine or just from being just a housewife for that matter, they were given better opportunities. And it was also done to help them access funds earmarked for development. It was meant to help them access funds for development as well. So in WID, this particular approach, the focus remained exclusively on developing strategies of integrating women into development. They thought of ways in which women could have a better role in this development arena, along with its competence to address other cultural and legal factors that led to unequal status of women in mainstream development. This approach was considered as less successful, or rather, one of the main shortcomings of this WID approach was its incompetence to address other cultural and legal factors. So there came a limitation with respect to this approach. So this limitation in the WID approach in a way led to the rise of another approach, that is towards the later half of 1970s, and this new approach came to be known as the WARD approach of gender and development. What is actually the WARD approach of gender and development? It is Women and Development approach, which followed a Marxist feminist approach. What do you mean by Marxist feminist approach? It is a type of feminism that followed the features of Marxism as well. So I expect you to look into the textbook while listening to my lecture. So if you try to do so, you will keep track of the page numbers as well. Right now we are discussing page number 119 of Unit 9 of BSOG 173. So according to this word approach, the actual problem does not lie within the economic structures of the society, but where does this problem lie? It lies in its class segregation and wealth distribution process. So in order to challenge the inequalities of these structures, it was important to recognize the productive and reproductive contributions of women in development. But do you think this was completely successful? Obviously not. Even this approach had its own shortcomings. This particular approach fell short of addressing the social relationship between man and women and their impact on environment. So one major demerit of this particular word approach can be said that it failed to address the social relations between men and women and their impact on development. So that was about the two major approaches regarding gender and development that came into prominence during the 1970s. Which are these approaches? Namely, the WID and WOD approaches. WID refers to women in development, whereas WAD refers to women and development. So is that clear? May I please know your response? Yes, thank you. Thank you for your response. Now, shall we move on to the next section? That is the GAD approach and Moser's model. So, in the previous section, we looked at the developments during the 1970s, and now in this particular section, we look at the developments that happened during the time period of 1980s, namely the GAD approach and Moser's model. So this was the time of the third wave of feminism. Women in the Latin America and other developing nations still didn't enjoy full citizenship and were not considered as significant socio-economic subjects. That's something about the socio-political situation of the then times. So the recognition of such a gap, what gap? The men's labor was obviously recognized and they had salaries for that, whereas the productive and reproductive labor of women still remained unrecognized and unappreciated. So naturally, these people identified a gap, especially the feminists identify this gap, and as a result of the recognition of this gap, what emerged? The GAD approach emerged. Alright. So this gap led to the emergence of another approach to perceive women in development called gender and development approach. So do you know which school of feminist thought actually influenced the GAD approach? It was the socialist feminist thought that influenced this particular approach. Unlike the WID and WOD approaches that we already recognized, here the participation of women in development was not correctly recognized. Okay, the gendered distribution of roles and responsibilities remained ultimately detrimental to the well-being of the learners. So this approach associated development with the change in the social or gender relationships prevalent in the society. That is, the oppression of women in the private spheres or families also figured prominently in this approach. This is because this particular approach, the GAD approach, focused on developing programs to address violence against women. That's an important point. They tried to develop programs to address violence against women and thereby to control it. It also sought to develop projects to address the division of labor between man and woman, and issues concerning access and control of resources between them were also tried to be addressed using this particular approach. So in emphasizing the productive and reproductive roles of women, the GAD approach favored that the state should take the responsibility for supporting the social reproduction role played by women in the form of bearing, caring and nurturing these children. So this is on page number 121, the very first paragraph. This is important. As per the GAD approach, it was mentioned that the state should take responsibility for supporting the social reproduction role played by women. So such a focus on the social well-being of women was a shift from the earlier two approaches. Which were the two approaches? With and Ward approaches, because these were purely economic in their attention to the interaction between gender and development. So in a way, by acknowledging the role of a state in ensuring equitable development to both men and women, this approach accepted the dynamic nature of development. That is, it favored the equal development of both men and women. So in order to strengthen women's legal rights, this approach advocated for the need of women to organize themselves into more effective political voice. That is one important point. So this formed the basis of a gender planning model. Why was this gender planning model developed? Any idea? It is simply for the development programs. Okay. So it is developed by a feminist called Caroline Moser. That is what we mean by Moser's model here. So in one of her papers, whose paper? Caroline Moser's paper, titled Gender Planning in the Third World, Meeting Practical and Strategic Gender Needs. So in this particular paper, she differentiated between practical and strategic needs of women. What do you mean by practical and strategic needs? See, while practical needs meant women's access to basic needs. What are the basic needs? Say, food, shelter, etc. are obviously the basic needs, whereas the strategic needs questioned the subordination within the gender system of the society. Subordination to men, for that matter. Yes. So this included needs like equal pay for equal work, control over their sexuality, reproductive rights. That is the basic rights of all couples to decide freely the number, the timing of their children, etc. Protection from gender-based violences. We know even these days violence against women is very much common, and the media, whenever we have a look at the media news, etc., this is one topic that often comes up. Moser's model became internationally recognized by agencies such as UN and World Bank, and we can say that it still remains an integral part of the hegemonic canon for development planning. So in this particular session, we dealt with the GAD approach and Moser's model. GAD approach is actually gender and development approach. What are the main things addressed here? It focused on developing programs to address violence against women. It sought to develop projects to address the division of labor between men and women, and also issues concerning control of resources between men and women. Whereas this particular model developed by a feminist named Caroline Moser as part of her paper Gender Planning in the Third World differentiated between practical and strategic needs of women, and it became recognized by WB, UN, etc., and still remains an integral part of development planning. So in the 1970s, it was the Witt and Ward approaches that were in prominence. In the 1980s, there came the Gadd and Moses model. And if we move further, we must have to discuss neoliberalism and post-colonial feminism. Before that, I would like to check your understanding regarding these two terms, neoliberalism and post-colonial feminism. So first and foremost, let me ask you, do you have any idea regarding neoliberalism? It's okay, I can explain. Neoliberalism simply is a political approach that favors free market capitalism, deregulation and reduction in government spending. I suppose while you studied the other units, I really know that sir did try to explain everything in detail. So if you attended the other sessions, such things would be clear to you, because in the previous units, these were the things that we discussed. So that is neoliberalism. And moving on to post-colonialism, that is one thing you all know. Just have a look at these two words, post-colonialism. What would be the meaning? Can you try to guess it if in case you are not aware of it? Yes, correct. Post-colonialism. Yes. Now try to link the idea of post-colonial along with feminism. What would be post-colonial feminism? Yeah. What would be post-colonial feminism? So this very term post-colonial refers to something that exists after the end of the colonial rule. So post-colonial feminism can be considered as a form of feminism that developed as a response to feminism, focusing solely on the expression of women in Western cultures and former colonies. So let's now focus our attention towards section 9.4 titled Neoliberalism and Post-Colonial Feminism. I'm looking at the text as such now. So under neoliberalism, women finally became visible, considerably visible as subjects in development, but still there wasn't enough recognition. The labor market, women suffered wage discrimination and also unequal treatment. See, at the home, they were feeding the family, which was traditionally women's job, which was traditionally considered as women's job, and hence it became very difficult for them to balance these two. It became very difficult. This indicated towards newer forms of patriarchal discrimination against women in both public and private spheres. We already discussed the concept of patriarchy. So this led to the development of cycle of poverty of women and feminization of poverty. As a result, at the Second World Conference of Women in the year 1985, a women network was created. It was titled DAWN, that is the Development Alternatives in Women for a New Era. So this rejected the narrow definition of development as economic growth. Instead, what did they do? This new network argued that crisis in the living standards of women were led consumerism and indebtedness. So we can say that this particular network, that is DAWN, redefined development. How did they do so? I would like to read the quote out. That is, I quote, "The socially responsible management and use of resources, the elimination of gender subordination and social inequality and the organizational restructuring that can bring these about. I unquote. That is, it insisted that economic development should be seen as a tool for achieving a comprehensive human development. The post-colonial feminists critiqued development policies as a continuing form of colonialism. So you have an instance mentioned in the textbook. There is a mention regarding Mohanty and her 1997 work. Who is Mohanty? She is Chandra Talpade Mohanty, an Indian feminist, and her particular work in consideration is Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures. So in this particular work, she argues that homogenizing women into a single category reduces women into their gender category, thereby ignoring other factors that are crucial to their identity, like class and ethnicity. That is, by trying to categorize every single woman into a single category, their other kind of identity based on class and ethnicity are kind of neglected. According to Mohanty, she stresses on transcultural feminism. What exactly is that? It is a type of feminism based on feminist solidarity. What do you mean by that? In Malayalam we say Aikyadarthyam. Okay, that is what we mean by solidarity. So this is neither colonialistic in nature nor racist in nature. And like this Mohanty, there is another post-colonial feminist called Gayatri Spivak. So she also defines development as a neo-colonial successor of the civilizing mission of imperialism. We discussed imperialism in our last class. So this particular work by Spivak is a critique of post-colonial racism. Alright, so in this session we discussed neo-liberalism and post-colonial feminism and their connection with development. So in this section, one important aspect to remember is the dawn, that women network that was formed in the year 1985. You should also remember the instances mentioned, which includes Mohanty and Spivak and their contributions towards this. Alright, so I understand that you might find this section difficult. Why is it difficult? It is because you will have to remember a lot of things. May that be the titles of works, or may that be the names of these feminist critiques, or may that be the approaches or their short forms or abbreviations for that matter. One tip that I always tell you is to make note of these things. Dear learners, it is high time for you to start preparing for the upcoming TEE, because BSOG 173 is a comparatively new paper introduced by IGNOU, and hence you need to have effective preparation for your successful completion of this paper. As you know, you will have essay questions for 20 marks from these units, so it demands good or better preparation. Keep notes of the main points as I mentioned in my last class. I'll make sure that I'll give you a special session on the important questions or the ways to attempt the BSOG question paper. Do you find that helpful? Now we'll move on to section 9.5 titled Ecofeminism. So we'll deal with this topic in the next session.